It is with great pleasure and honor to extend my warm welcome to each and every one of you on behalf of Ramakrishna Vedanta Association of Thailand. We gather here not only as an individual but as a seeker of wisdom, harmony, and service to humanity. Ramakrishna Vedanta Association of Thailand is not just an organization, it is a center of spiritual enlightenment inspired by the profound teaching of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. Our objective, woven into very fabrics of our existence, is to illuminate the path of knowledge, harmony, and service, a path that bridges the gap between religion and foster a deep understanding of the culture and the universal truth that binds us all. Sri Ramakrishna, a saint of unparalleled spiritual realization, and Swami Vivekananda, a dynamic and visionary philosopher, has left an indelible mark on the world through their teaching. Our association strives to carry forward their legacy by disseminating their profound wisdom which transcends the boundary of time, culture, and creed. The core philosophy of Ramakrishna Vedanta Association revolves around the harmony of religion. In a world marked by diversity, it is crucial to recognize the common thread that unites all faiths and philosophies. By promoting the ideal of religious harmony, we aim to foster a spirit of tolerance, understanding, and unity among the people of different beliefs. Equally significant is our commitment to serve God through serving humanity. The teaching of Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda emphasize the divinity inherent in every individual and the sanctity of selfless service. Our association endeavor to channel this spiritual service to uplift the less fortunate, promote education, and contribute to the well-being of the society at large. As we embark on this noble journey, let us remember that our collective efforts can make a profound impact on the world. By embracing the teaching of Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, we not only enrich our own life but also contribute to greater good of humanity. I extend my heartiest gratitude to each one of you for joining us today and being a part of transformative journey. Together, let us strive for a world where the light of wisdom, the harmony of religion, the spirit of selfless service illuminate the path to a brighter and more compassionate future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachitji, for the wonderful note. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me usher you to the most awaited part of this evening. We have the privilege of having Swami Medhananda with us today, who very kindly agreed to our request of sharing his learned thoughts. Maharaji, as we fondly address him as, shall educate and address us all on the topic of 3 Gunas in spiritual life. Okay. Before we move on, although if I had to print out, I would have printed out a book, but I could take out some excerpts of the recognitions and the abilities of Swami Medhananda. Swami Medhananda is a monk of Ramakrishna order and an academic philosopher, currently serving as a senior research fellow in philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood. He is also a Hindu chaplain at both UCLA and the University of Southern California. He is section editor of the International Journal of Hindu Studies, overseeing the submissions in Hindu and cross-cultural philosophy of religion. From 2010 to 2021, he was the associate professor and head of program in philosophy at Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Education and Research Institute in Belur Math, which is in Kolkata, West Bengal. His current research focuses on global philosophy of religion, cosmopsychism, religious epistemology, and Vedantic philosophical traditions, especially philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. Swami Medhananda has been honored with various awards, recognitions, and fellowships in esteemed institutions and bodies across the world. He has been invited to lecture at the Princeton University, Oxford University, WWU Münster, École Normale Supérieure, University of Edinburgh, Waseda University in Japan, and the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, among other institutions globally. He earned his PhD in 2009 from the University of California at Berkeley, where he specialized in German aesthetics. He also is a Fulbright scholar at the Humboldt University and a visiting student at Magdalen College, Oxford University. He is the author of 3 books: Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, Oxford University Press, published in 2022, The Infinite Pasto, Infinite Reality, and Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. He is the editor of the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta. He is currently also writing a book on karma and rebirth in Hinduism, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press, amongst numerous of his works across. So this is just a little that I could, take an excerpt and not taking much of time. And please pardon me if I have, missed out scrolls and scrolls of recognitions and abilities that you elucidate. So Swamiji, may we request the pleasure of you having here and enlighten us with some words of wisdom. Thank you.
Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in Bangkok for the first time in my life, and thank you so much to everyone here for making my stay here, my very brief but memorable stay here, so pleasant. This morning, Prabhuji took me to Lumbini Park, went for a nice jog, and then had a wonderful, I'm a big fan of coconut water. So this is the best place to be for coconut water. I had this amazing coconut water after my jog. It really hit the spot. So today I'm talking about the 3 gunas in spiritual life. A practical guide. You might think this sounds like a very theoretical topic, philosophical topic. How is it practical? But I want to make a case that it's intensely practical. For every spiritual aspirant, it's extremely important to understand the workings of the 3 gunas. I'm sometimes asked, what are my 2 desert island books? And I have a very quick response. I say the Bhagavad Gita and the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. What is it that I like about these 2 books so much? One of the things is that both of these great scriptures teach the highest spiritual philosophy, and they're also incredibly practical. At the end of every chapter of the Gita, when you chant it traditionally in Sanskrit, there's a colophon. Om Tat Saditi Srimad Bhagavad Gita Su Upanishadsu Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre. The Gita is described using 2 words. One is, it teaches Brahma Vidya, the science of Brahman, the highest spiritual truth. But secondly, it's also a great yoga shastra. It's an incredibly practical spiritual manual that takes us where we are, takes us by the hand and shows us, points us in the right direction and helps move us in the right direction to make further spiritual progress. It's never too high-pitched, even for ordinary spiritual aspirants. And one could say exactly the same thing about the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So it's a book that some of you, I'm sure, have already read. If you haven't, I strongly recommend that you look at it. Because Sri Ramakrishna there teaches very high spiritual philosophy, but brings it down to earth for everyday spiritual aspirants. That's the wonder of these two texts. And another thing that's striking about both of these great scriptures is that they talk constantly about the three gunas. If you read the Gospel from cover to cover, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, you'll find Sri Ramakrishna talking about the gunas almost on every page. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. We'll get to that in a second. Bhagavad Gita, it comes up in many different chapters. The three gunas, chapter 14, 17, 18, and other chapters. Why? Why does Bhagavan Krishna, why does Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna, why do they harp on the gunas so much? Because they knew it's incredibly important for spiritual aspirants to understand. So in today's talk, and I don't want this to be just a kind of top-down talk, I want to hear from you as well. So I'd really like to make this interactive, and I'd love to hear from you at the end of the talk. I'm sure you'll have some questions. What are the three gunas? It's the first question we'll try to tackle. Why is an understanding of the three gunas so important in spiritual life? So, first of all, this perennial problem of translation. Some of you know Sanskrit, I'm sure. Many of you know some Indian language. So you'll know it's notoriously difficult to translate from Indian languages to English. Often when the word guna is translated in English, the word quality is used. That's not my favorite translation for different reasons. Partly because quality implies that it's an attribute of something else. And guna seems to me to be something even more fundamental. And so I think a term from physics might be useful, actually. I like the term energy. Translating gunas as energies, the three energies in spiritual life. Because energy, even in physics, it manifests in different forms. E equals mc squared, right? In the same way in spiritual life, these three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, it manifests in our day-to-day behavior in a wide variety of ways. And scriptures like the Bhagavad Gita and like the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna explain all the different ways that the gunas, these three gunas, manifest in our day-to-day life. How we can recognize these manifestations and then try to make progress on the spiritual path by becoming more and more sattvic. That's the basic idea. So what are these three energies? Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Many of you are already familiar with them, but I'll just give a brief overview for those who are not familiar. Sattva. People who have a preponderance of sattva, the energy of sattva, tend to be humble, quiet, self-effacing, kind of naturally spiritually inclined, compassionate. When they see people in suffering, they just feel this natural urge to serve them in some way. People who have a lot of rajas, by contrast, they tend to be a little egoistic, sometimes very egoistic. Depends on how much rajas they have. They tend to boast about their own accomplishments, their own achievements. They tend to be very ambitious. I want to do this, I want to achieve this. They tend to be full of desires and attachments for things of the world. And people with a lot of tamas tend to be a bit lazy, tend to sleep a lot, they tend to procrastinate, they tend to miss deadlines. Often they suffer from brain fog, a certain kind of mental confusion, not having clarity about their purpose in life, where they're going, what they should be doing on a day-to-day basis. They tend to have not really a very clear vision of what they want to do with their life, these kinds of things. That's tamas. So these are different manifestations of the three energies, just in a kind of nutshell. Now, if if you've attended spiritual discourses in the past, if you've read great scriptures like the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Bible, you'll know that the goal of life, at least from a Vedantic standpoint, is God realization, or otherwise known as realization of our higher self, to capital S, S-E-L-F. So then another question might come up. So why are you talking so much about the Gunas? Who cares about the Gunas? Isn't the point to transcend the three Gunas? It is. The highest goal, of course, is to transcend even Sattva. But what's important to keep in mind is that's a very, very high ideal. That's the highest ideal. But we can't skip steps in spiritual life. And on a day-to-day basis, as spiritual aspirants, of course we have to keep in mind that the ultimate goal is God realization. But the proximate goal, what do I mean by proximate goal? I mean the nearer goal, the immediate goal for us ordinary spiritual aspirants on a day-to-day basis is to become as sattvic as possible. This is a very important thing. I'm going to repeat this several times in the course of the talk. Yes, the ultimate goal is God realization, self-realization, but on a day-to-day basis, that's too high-pitched an ideal for most of us, and it's too high an ideal for us to kind of orient our lives around, usually. But one thing that each of us can strive to do on a daily basis is to make ourselves as sattvic as possible. Okay? And this is why all the great sages talk so much about the three gunas. Okay? And I mentioned Sri Ramakrishna and the Bhagavad Gita, but I can name many more great saints who have also talked about the gunas. Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj and many others. Sri Ramakrishna, in his own inimitable way, he used to teach, like Jesus, using parables. And so when he talked about the three gunas, he knew that this might sound very abstract, technical, so he used a beautiful parable to explain it. He said, one day there's a very wealthy man walking along the road. And he's caught by three robbers. I think you can probably guess who the three robbers are. The three robbers represent Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, respectively. And the robber representing Tamas robs him of his money and then tells the other two robbers, we got what we wanted from him, so let's kill him. Who needs him? And if we let him go, he might tell on us and we might get in trouble. Let's kill him. Tamas, because Tamas destroys, Tamas kills, Tamas confuses, Tamas deludes. That's the first robber. The second robber, Rajas, representing Rajas, he says, whoa, let's not go that far. We've taken his money. Let's bind him to this tree so that he can't run away, but let's not kill him. That's going too far. So they take the time to bind him with very strong rope. And this poor man is helplessly tied to this tree. And the three robbers go on their way, with this money, of course. The third robber, representing Sattva, after leaving the other two robbers, quietly comes back to this poor gentleman and says, you poor fellow, I'm so sorry about what we did to you. Please let me untie you. Very gently unties it one strand at a time so that his arms aren't injured, his wrists aren't injured. He helps him up and he says, I'm so sorry. I know you must be confused and lost. This is the way you need to go, and this will take you on the right path. And this person is so touched. He says, you've done so much for me, I'm so grateful. Why don't you come with me? And this third robber, representing Sattva, says, where you're going, I can't come with you. You have to go alone on this way. That's Sattva. It points you to the way to the highest goal. It can take you up to the entrance to that road, and it'll point you in the right direction. And then you have to go even beyond Sattva. This is the story. But many of us, especially in spiritual life, we try to find shortcuts. Recently, cannabis was legalized in Bangkok. So there are shops all over the place now. In the US, it's already legalized in many states. I went to a conference in Amsterdam a few months ago. The conference was on, the topic was the entropy of mystical experience. But the vast majority of these people we're doing research in psychedelics and the kind of spiritual experiences that come from ingesting psychedelics like ayahuasca and LSD. It's now kind of all the rage to do these drugs in order to get these instant spiritual experiences. Why go to all the trouble of spiritual practice if you can get it like this, by just taking a pill or a mushroom, whatever it is? You know? But spiritual life is not so easy. It's not so easy. And you can't really skip steps. If you do, there's a great danger. There's a danger that you're not physically, mentally, and spiritually ready for that spiritual experience. And you can be prone to all sorts of hallucinations. I lived in India for 13 years, from 2009 to 2022, and then I was asked to come to Hollywood and serve in our monastery there. And one thing that struck me when I first came to the US was that I would give a talk like this, followed by question and answers. And about half the questions were people in the audience raising their hand and bragging about their spiritual experiences. I had this experience and that experience, and it's very odd. If you really had a spiritual experience, there should be no reason for you to be sharing this with the rest of the world. So there's a lot of danger of self-deception in spiritual life. We have to be very, very careful. We have to be on our guard. And understanding the three gunas really helps us. And let's be honest with ourselves. Realization of the self, realization of God is the highest ideal, but it's still a very far ideal for us, for most of us, if we're honest with ourselves. But what we can do is to try to make ourselves more and more sattvic by tweaking, by changing, first of all, by looking at our lifestyle. What do we do in the course of the day? How tamasic are the activities we engage in? How tamasic or sattvic or rajasic is our behavior with other human beings, with our being in the world? And how do we make each of our activities, each of our thoughts, words, and deeds more and more sattvic? That should be our immediate aim in spiritual life on a day-to-day basis. And the great saints really help us in doing this because they give very concrete examples. Let me read you one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. He says, God cannot be realized without sattva. Love, discrimination, kindness, and so on. Then he says, it is the very nature of rajas to involve a person in many worldly activities. Rajas binds. Remember, the tamasic robber wanted to kill the poor fellow. Rajas says, let's just tie him up. Binds us to the world. Rajoguna binds us to the world. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, that is why rajas degenerates into tamas. If a person is entangled in too many activities, he surely forgets God. He becomes more and more attached to lust and greed. So in a very succinct way, he's explaining all three of the gunas. And how if we become too rajasic, ultimately that rajas will degenerate into tamas and will actually regress, will not just stagnate, but will regress in spiritual life. So our priority has to be becoming as sattvic as possible in our day-to-day lives. Another thing that this teaching alludes to in a very subtle way, and I think it's very helpful for many spiritual aspirants. In spiritual life, we have to tackle what are called the 6 great enemies, Shad Ripu in Sanskrit, lust, anger, greed, jealousy, and so on and so forth. And in the beginning of spiritual life, many people struggle especially with dealing with very strong feelings like lust and anger. And the rookie mistake that many people make, that many spiritual aspirants make, I made it myself, many people, in the beginning is, they take the head-on approach. They say, lust, I'm going to kill you. And then you try to tackle it head-on, and it backfires most of the time. Because you give that feeling more strength by tackling it head-on. You give it more importance than it deserves, you see. Now, what Sri Ramakrishna is hinting at here is there is a wiser, there is a more effective, and from the standpoint of the long term, strategy for dealing with these very strong feelings of lust and anger and greed. What is that? It's the indirect approach. The indirect approach to dealing with these negative worldly feelings is this, that lust and anger and greed at bottom, all of these strong feelings stem from rajas. The guna of rajas, the energy of rajas. So the indirect approach to tackling these very difficult worldly feelings is to make yourself sattvic. Because what happens is the more sattvic you become, the less these feelings will have force. They're kind of naturally, they're going to die more of a natural death. They'll diminish in their intensity. They won't come up as often in the thoughts. You see what I mean? That's the indirect approach. And later, hopefully I'll have time to do this, I'll talk about how the Bhagavad Gita, it mentions both approaches in the same chapter, in chapter 2. But for more mature spiritual aspirants, I think that the better approach is this indirect approach. Bhagavad Gita chapter 3, there's a sloka. Arjuna, he represents the everyday spiritual aspirant. Arjuna asks Krishna, Atakyena prayuktoyam papam charati purushaha anichana vivashneya baladeva niyojitaha. Krishna, what is it that makes me commit sinful actions, even against my own will? I don't want to do it. But something is making me do it as if by force. Krishna's answer, Kama esha krodha esha rajoguna samudbhavaha mahashano mahapapma vidhenam havainam. What are these forces, these very strong forces that make you commit sin even against your own will? Kama and krodha, lust and anger. Rajoguna samudbhavaha, both of which stem from rajas, the energy of rajas. Mahashano mahapapma, both of these are mahashano, all devouring. The more you feed these things, they're like these insatiable beasts. The more you feed it, the bigger it'll grow and the more ravenous it becomes. These things are never satisfied. Mahapapma, in the source of all sin, vidyenam ehavaidinam, know these things to be your enemies in spiritual life. So how do you tackle these enemies? The indirect approach is try to reduce your rajas. Try to become more sattvic. And then automatically, these strong feelings of lust and anger and greed and jealousy, they'll diminish in intensity. And you can deal with them in a more productive and mindful way. So, as spiritual aspirants, understanding the workings of the three gunas is extremely important in two main respects. Number one, I think this is very important and it's not emphasized enough, I think, in spiritual discourses. Brutally honest self-assessment. Brutally honest self-assessment. Where do we stand? You know, in a company, you might have a meeting with your manager or boss once in a while, and it's the boss who tells you, here are your strengths, here are your weaknesses, pluses and minuses, here's where room for improvement, how you can improve. Each spiritual aspirant needs to do that with him or herself. It helps to have a kind of loved one, either a spouse or somebody who can kind of put you in your place. Because the danger is self-deception. Because the ego is deeply invested in kind of flattering ourselves and making us think that we're much more spiritually evolved than we actually are. This is true of each one of us in the room, including myself. So sometimes it's helpful as a reality check to say, I think that this is one of my strengths. What do you think? Asking your spouse or somebody that, you know, or your kid, your son, your daughter. And they'll say, well, I think that's going too far, Mom. So brutally honest self-assessment. How do the three gunas help us in doing this and engaging in this task of brutally honest self-assessment? Because when we study scriptures like the Bhagavad Gita, like the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, it teaches us all the different ways that these energies manifest in our day-to-day life. And we can track from the moment we wake up in the morning, even before we wake up, how long do we sleep for? If it's 10 hours, maybe we have a little bit too much stomachs. Let's try to reduce it to 8 hours. When we wake up, what's the first thing we do? Do we hop onto social media? And maybe that's because of rajas. Do we drink a shot of whiskey? That's more tamasic. You see, you should track everything you do in the course of the day and ask yourself, is what I'm doing sattvic? Is it rajasic or is it tamasic? That's brutally honest self-assessment. Where do I stand honestly? Honestly. We all want to think that we're very sattvic, but most of the time it's not true. And it might be that we're highly sattvic in certain respects and highly rajasic or highly tamasic in other respects in the course of the same day. We sit in meditation, we can have a deep meditation in the morning and maybe in the evening. But once we get out, we start quarreling with everybody. Start shouting at our kids, quarreling with our boss. That's not very sattvic. You see? So understanding how these three gunas manifest in every walk of life is extremely helpful in this task of brutally honest self-assessment. And I say brutally, it might sound harsh, but without that, it's just self-assessment, and then we're all going to flatter ourselves. And we don't want that, because then we short-circuit any spiritual progress. If we already think we're spiritually evolved, that short-circuits any further spiritual evolution. The second main reason why understanding the three gunas is so important is because once we do this self-assessment, we know where we stand. Second is, it helps us understand where we need to get. We need to make ourselves as sattvic as possible. And it tells us, well, look, if your behavior is primarily rajasic, here's how to make it more sattvic. That's the beauty of these wonderful scriptures. I'll talk about this in a second. Okay, so keep all this in mind. So Bhagavad Gita, for instance, chapter 17, it gives a very long, comprehensive, I don't want to say comprehensive because the list can go on forever, but it details many different kinds of activities and human behaviors on the basis of these three gunas. I'll mention some of them. Faith. Faith, you might think, well, that's a wonderful quality. It must be sattvic. It's inherently sattvic. No. Gita says there's a rajasic kind of faith, shraddha. There's a tamasic kind of shraddha, and there's a sattvic kind of shraddha. Food. We all have to eat. But what kind of food do we eat? And how attached are we to the food? So, the Gita will explain that highly tamasic people like a certain type of food. Highly rajasic people like a different kind of food. Highly sattvic people like a different kind of food. And very sattvic people you'll find are not overly attached to food. They'll eat it, they can take it, they can leave it. They eat it to eat. They eat to live. They don't live to eat. Rajasic people, they live to eat. Three kinds of sacrifice. This is also mentioned. Yajna. In chapter 17 of the Bhagavad Gita. Three kinds of austerities. Again, you might think austerity it's a spiritual practice. It's inherently sattvic. No. There's a rajasic way of doing austerity. You know what it is? It's when somebody will do austerities, but in a very public way, in a very showy way, so that through the corner of their eye they're looking. You see how great a tapasvi I am? Look at these austerities I'm doing. I bet you can't do that. This is rajasic. Behind that austerity is this desire for name and fame, for impressing others. That's rajas. That comes from rajas. Gita also talks about three kinds of giving, three kinds of charity, charitable activity. Again, charity is a wonderful thing, right? Should be sattvic. No, wrong. There's a very rajasic way of doing charity. What does that look like? You can probably imagine. Let's say I'm a billionaire. I give $10 million to a cancer research institute. No strings attached? No. I want a big golden plaque saying this wing of the building was donated by Swami Medhananda. And then I look at that and I feel gratified. This is what Swami Vedanta used to call sanctified shopkeeping. I talk big about how charitable I am, how great a spiritual aspirant I am, but I want something in return. That's rajasic giving. It's never no strings attached. Tamasic giving is very interesting. According to the Gita, see, there's an art to giving. This is very important to keep in mind. Don't just throw money at somebody. This is not the way to give in a sattvic way. Satpatra, you should make sure that the recipient of your charity is a fit recipient. That doesn't mean that you should be judgmental and no, not that. But just imagine, think about the situation. There's a homeless person, a poor person. What they desperately need is food, but they're also addicted to drugs and alcohol. Now, there are different ways that you can be helping this person or serving this person. One is, you give them $100. If you give them $100, what will they most likely do with it? They're probably going to buy alcohol and drugs. Is that going to help them in the long run? No. But if you go and buy them a nice hot meal and give them that meal, you are nourishing them and you're not feeding their addictions. The tamasika person will just throw money at the person, not even care about what that person actually needs, you see. So Sattvika giving involves knowing whom to give to, what to give to that person, which will maximally benefit them, and giving it with the correct inner attitude, which means without expecting anything in return. Not even a thank you. Some people, they'll give something and they're expecting a little thank you, a little, you know. But if you don't get that thank you, and if you don't have any inner reaction, then you know that you're giving in a sattvic way. So you should always be testing yourself, checking yourself, being mindful. What are my inner motivations for doing these things? The Gunas helps us do this kind of self-analysis. And the list goes on. Gita, hopefully I'll talk about this later. It explains there are three kinds of sukham, of happiness. Sattvika happiness, rajasika happiness, tamasika happiness. We'll talk about it more later. Sri Ramakrishna too, he talks about, because he meets so many different people in the course of the day, and he was a very subtle psychologist. He understood human nature so deeply and so well. And he would immediately catch this person is behaving in a very rajasic manner. Noticing very subtle cues in their behavior, you know. For instance, he mentions once, he was walking one day back to his room, and there's a Brahmin, or there's somebody who sits in the same place every day. And usually he's very kind of, he'll just do a namaskar and won't talk much. This time, this person says, "Oh, Bamun, how are you doing today?" And kind of twirls his mustache. And Shri Ramakrishna says, immediately I understood he came into some money. Just from his behavior, just about the tone of his voice, it changed suddenly overnight. You know? So Shri Ramakrishna was very observant about these things. Another thing I want to mention though, is that we shouldn't think that spiritual life is explained once and for all in these ancient scriptures. We should make these scriptures our own. And the beauty of the three gunas is that we can adapt and we can expand this paradigm and make it apply to 2023, life right now, into each of our individual lives. That's the beauty of it. And I'll talk about that as well a little bit later in the talk. So, Sri Ramakrishna, in the gospel, he distinguishes different kinds of bhakti. He says that there's a sattvika kind of bhakti and a rajasika kind of bhakti. What's the difference? He says, the sattvika bhakta means a devotee, a spiritual aspirant, a genuine spiritual aspirant. A sattvika spiritual aspirant is somebody who, in the middle of the night, let's think of India now, so it's a land of mosquitoes. And so at night you need a mosquito net. Do we need them in Bangkok? No, sometimes. Okay. So anyway, in India it's a necessity in most places, except in the Himalayas. And so they sleep inside a mosquito net. This person, the sattvika spiritual aspirant, instead of sleeping, they're engaged in spiritual practices almost throughout the night. Japa, dhyana, prayer. Nobody knows. And that person might wake up fairly late in the morning. Why? Because he's up all night doing spiritual practices. Other people might say, "Oh, this lazy bum, good for nothing. You know, we woke up at 7 in the morning and this guy's still sleeping at 10. And that person will say nothing. Nobody will know. It says the Rajasika Bhakta, the Rajasika spiritual aspect, is somebody who, in the midst of a gathering like this, will pray in a very kind of ostentatious way. He gives these beautiful details. He says he's wearing a japa mala, these rosary beads, strewn with gems to attract attention. These are priceless, really costly gems. And to the corner of his eye, he'll be looking. Are you watching how great a spiritual aspect? How deeply I'm praying. How great a meditator I am. This is a Rajasika spiritual aspect, you see. It might not be very obvious, but if you analyze yourself, if you analyze others, you'll find it manifesting in these more subtle ways. So be very careful. And we should try to make even our spiritual practices, when we sit in the morning, we should try to make that as sattvic as possible. That's why Jesus, he taught the same thing in the Bible. Jesus said, go to your room, shut the door behind you, and pray to God in secret. And then God will reward you openly. It's the same logic. All these great saints, Sri Ramakrishna used to say, all jackals howl alike. And you'll find that many of Jesus' teachings and Sri Ramakrishna's, they match. Another thing we need to ask ourselves as spiritual aspirants, how do we interact and behave with other people? Our spouses, our children, our loved ones, our co-workers, our colleagues, people on the street, strangers. How are our interactions? Are they sattvic? Are they rajasic? Are they tamasic? And you might find that you need to be more fine-grained. You might say, I'm an incredibly capable and generous leader at work, but somehow when I come back home, I'm pretty nasty to my husband or my wife. So you have to be very, very fine-grained in this analysis. You can't just say, I'm sattvic across the board with everybody. Usually that's not true. You might be very good to your kid and very bad to your spouse, for instance. And then you have to ask yourself, why is that? And how do I make my interactions with my loved one, my kid, my spouse, my boss, more sattvic? So what do I mean? What does it mean? What is a sattvic kind of relationship, sattvic interaction with your spouse, let's say? A sattvic relationship is one where you see yourselves as partners on the spiritual path. C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book called Four Loves. He was a great Christian theologian, thinker, and scholar at Oxford University. And he said that the difference between the love of friendship and erotic love, he says, erotic love it's a love that's face-to-face, and it can sometimes become claustrophobic, cramping. It's just the two of you. It's like, that's why lovers, they forget about the rest of the world. Stereotypically, Romeo and Juliet, these famous love stories. Friendship, the love of friendship, is a love where you walk side by side. I love that metaphor. It's a very beautiful metaphor. Sattvika relationships, even with your spouse that you've been with for 50 years, you walk side by side. And it might be, see, in Hinduism, every Hindu is taught marriage itself is a sacred rite, and if you're a genuine spiritual aspirant, the marriage itself needs to evolve. And one way of putting that evolution in marriage is that you should be evolving away from this face-to-face kind of relationship and evolving toward a side-by-side relationship. That's why in ancient Hindu culture, you're taught that there are 4 stages in life. The second stage is the householder stage. Third stage is the forest-dwelling stage, vanaprastha. Fourth stage is sannyasa. What does it mean? It means that the goal of life for every true Hindu is not bhoga, it's not enjoyment. It's moksha, it's liberation. And how do we get there? Even marriage is a stepping stone on the way to moksha. And so Sri Ramakrishna used to say to householder devotees who would come to him and say, you're talking all the time about renunciation, where does that leave us? And he says, after having 1 or 2 children, try to live with your spouse like brother and sister. This is the ideal. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's something to work toward. That's the idea. I mentioned that Sri Ramakrishna was a very astute psychologist, but I wanted to give you one example. One of his great devotees was Keshab Chandra Sen, who was a very famous orator and leader of a certain sect of the Brahmo Samaj in the 19th century. And he became very ill, Keshab Sen. Sri Ramakrishna went to visit him in his house. And he came at the exact time that he was asked to come. And the person in the house said, he'll come in a second. He'll come in a minute, just wait. And Sri Ramakrishna was waiting and waiting and waiting. 20 minutes go by, 30 minutes. Finally, Keshab comes. And he doesn't say anything. But later, the author of the gospel, Medhananda Gupta, he says, I hear you visited Keshab Sen. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, yes, how is he now? And then Medhananda Gupta says, he hasn't recovered to any extent from his illness. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, I found him to be very rajasic. I had to wait a long time before I could see him. It's a very interesting observation. Many of you, I'm sure, have had this experience. You go to meet a VIP or VVIP. It doesn't have to be Modi or somebody, but it could be, a CEO of a company. And they make an appointment, let's say 9 a.m. You come at 8:55, and you wait 9:05, 9:15, 9:45, and then they saunter in at 9:45. No apology. Why? Because that boosts their own importance. I'm so great that I'm making these people wait for me. So that's a sign of rajas. Okay, this is one example. Food. Here, Gita is very interesting. It's interesting because it's not very specific. If you look at the shlokas in chapter 17, shlokas 8 through 10, they're pretty general. It says some specific things, but not as specific as some people might like. It doesn't say that every spiritual aspirant must be vegetarian, for instance. That's just an example. Sattvika food, it's not sattvika food. This is another thing to keep in mind. Many people call different kinds of food sattvika, rajasic, tamasic. That's okay as a shorthand. But in the Gita, the different foods are not classified in terms of the three gunas. Different kinds of people prefer different kinds of food. That's the idea. So very sattvika people prefer food that is nourishing, healthy, succulent, not bland exactly, but not without too strong a taste. Very rajasic people like food which has very, very strong flavors. Extremely salty, extremely spicy, so that they're not satisfied until they start sweating when they eat their food. You know? And highly tamasic people like food which is stale, rotten, impure. Some people actually like food that, so actually all alcohol, for instance, falls in that category because it's fermented, right? As an example. So, one aspect of this brutally honest self-assessment is, what kind of food do I like? How much food do I eat? How attached am I to food? Ask yourself that. And if you're very rajasic, if you like very, very spicy foods and you spend half your day thinking about your next meal and what you're going to eat, what you're not going to eat, maybe it's time for kind of trying to become a little bit more sattvic in your dietary habits. It's just an example. The matter of vegetarianism is a very complicated one. Different traditions will tell you different things. Some traditions will say, you must be vegetarian, it's obvious. It's a no-brainer. Our tradition is more liberal, and we say it's an individual choice. You have to ask yourself what's best for you. And Sri Ramakrishna used to say, blessed is that person who feels longing for God, though he eats pork or beef. But shame on that person whose mind dwells on worldly things like lust and greed, though that person eats the purest havishan, boiled vegetables, rice and ghee. That's the deeper spiritual teaching about food. Many people, staunch vegetarians, become egoistic about being vegetarian, and they make it a crusade to convert the entire world to vegetarianism. That's rajasic, it's highly rajasic. It's a kind of superiority complex. It's a form of ego. I'm not saying you shouldn't be vegetarian, I am vegetarian. But don't become egoistic about it. I've already talked about the different kinds of charity, I mentioned that. So when you give, Jesus used to say, if you give with the right hand, you shouldn't even know what you're left. You give in such a way that you don't think again about it. You give as it's an opportunity for serving. That should be the attitude. You should never expect anything in return. No strings attached. That's sattvika giving. I promised that I'd talk about the three kinds of happiness. I think it's very important and very, very practical. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 18, shlokas 37 to 39, describes sattvika happiness, rajasika happiness, and tamasika happiness. Let's start with rajasika happiness. Vishayendriya sanyogad yattadagre mritopamam pariname vishmiva tatsukham rajasam sukam. Any pleasure which stems from the contact of your sense organs, eyes, ears, with sense objects is a rajasika form of happiness. What's the structure of all rajasika forms of happiness? In the beginning, it's like nectar. In the end, it's like poison. In the beginning, it's like amrita. In the end, it's like visham. Every form of instant gratification is rajasic. Why am I saying this and why am I emphasizing it? Because this is the age of instant gratification. We wake up in the morning, most of us pick up our smartphones, and then we're off. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everything, all these sophisticated algorithms. We have these brilliant masterminds, programmers, who understand very deeply what makes us tick. The moment we click on one video, what happens? It feeds us 10 more of those kinds of videos. Instant gratification. It's like these little, what is it from a scientific standpoint, from a neuroscientific standpoint? We're getting these little rushes of dopamine every time we hit another video. And it becomes an addiction. This is Rajasica happiness. We click on it because we like it. We're getting something from it. That's that amrita, that's that nectar in the beginning. In the end, we become wrecks. We become emotional wrecks. Some of you might have children who are wrestling with these issues, struggling with these issues, teenagers, teenage girls. There are many studies done on teenage girls who spend too much time on social media. What happens? They're comparing themselves, their physical beauty, their talents, their friend groups with other girls their age. And they become terribly depressed. Many, not all. There are lots of studies on this. And they've done these studies and they found that if you reduce their social media use, they become much happier. There are whole books written on this. Anna Lemke is a Stanford psychologist. She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation. And she says in the past, of course there were substance addictions, right? People who are addicted to heroin and cocaine and alcohol. Now she's saying almost all of us are behavioral addicts. We're all dopamine addicts. Because it's no longer through substances that we get our dopamine delivered to us, it's through things like social media. Through Netflix, what's called binge watching. When I grew up in Boston. One of my favorite shows was Seinfeld. I had to wait a week before I could see the next episode, right? Must-see Thursdays or whatever it was. You had to wait a week and it was exciting. And now, if you watch a new show, you can watch the entire season in one day. That's called binge watching. Isn't that instant gratification? At the end of watching 12 episodes of Game of Thrones or whatever, do you really feel good about yourself? Probably not. That's that poison in the end. You see. Now, by contrast, what is sattvika happiness? Yattad agre vishamiva parinamendritopamam tat sukham sattvikam proktam atma buddhi prasadajam. It's a very beautiful verse. Happiness that is like poison in the beginning and becomes like nectar in the end. Notice it's just the diametrical opposite of Rajasica happiness. And furthermore, this last phrase is so evocative in Sanskrit. Atma buddhi prasadajam. Sattvika happiness is born, jam, of the prasada, the satisfaction of the atma and buddhi, of the higher intelligence, which is buddhi, and the deeper soul within. Our deeper, eternal, spiritual self, our spiritual nature. What you're going to find if you analyze the different kinds of happiness in this world is that Rajasica happiness and Sattvika happiness, they're not just different in degree, they're different in kind. They're qualitatively different kinds of happiness. I'll say this more concretely. What kind of music do you listen to? When you step into your car, what kind of music do you listen to? Do you listen to the latest pop song? Or do you listen to bhajans? Or do you listen to, in the West, there's a beautiful genre called sacred classical music. Many of the great classical composers in the West were Christians or Jews, and they composed a lot of spiritual music, often putting to music beautiful psalms from the Bible. And Bach, for instance, has a giant piece called St. Matthew Passion. He did many cantatas, church cantatas. That's more sattvika kind of music. See, it's an acquired taste. In the beginning, it might be very boring. Many people say it's like elevator music, listening to this stuff. It's putting me to sleep. That's because you're not ready. You're not sattvik enough to appreciate it. But if you listen and you persist and you become more sattvik in other walks of life, you're going to find that you're going to be more naturally inclined to listen to that kind of music, bhajans and classical music. And that music that you used to listen to in the past, it'll somehow, it's not going to be as appealing to you. You're going to change the channel. No, nowadays it's not radio, it's Spotify and whatever, but you're going to be naturally inclined to listen to more sattvik things. You see? Atma buddhi prasadajam. Because when you listen to great classical music, great bhajans, you're satisfying not the body-mind, but the soul, the deeper soul. Just compare the latest pop song. Usually, the lyrics, highly worldly. Why'd you break up with me? I love you, why don't you love me? I have more money than you. This is very, very Rajasic. The themes are Rajasic, very strong bass lines. What is that? What happens when you get a strong bass line? You want to get on the floor and dance. very rajasic. Sattvika music makes you go inward. And it satisfies the deeper soul within. So rajasic music gratifies the ego. Sattvika music challenges the ego and says, hey, you are something deeper than the ego and much greater than the ego. You are eternal souls. You are sparks of immortality. You're children of immortal bliss. You see, that's what great music does. That's what great even films, for instance. You can also classify different films in this way. What kind of movies do you like? You know, there's Satyajit Ray. He's one of my favorite filmmakers. Pater Panchali and many other. And some of the great European filmmakers, Tarkovsky and Bergman is one of my favorites, a Swedish filmmaker. And then there are, of course, the greatest, the big Hollywood blockbusters, where you sit there, it's fun for that time, it's entertainment. But afterward, it's like it leaves you none the better, you see. Another thing I mentioned, Martin Seligman, some of you might have heard of his name. He's one of the most prominent positive psychologists. Does anyone know what positive psychology is? Yeah. It's a field within psychology that starts where traditional psychology leaves off. Traditional psychology deals with people who have mental disorders of some sort, whether it's anxiety or depression or some kind of neurosis. And the aim of traditional psychology is to make you normal, quote unquote normal. Positive psychology says being normal is not enough. Just not being depressed is not enough. How do you take your life to the next level? Martin Seligman is one of the kind of pioneers in this field of positive psychology. He wrote a book called Authentic Happiness. And he distinguishes different kinds of happiness, very much along the lines of the Gita, which was, of course, a millennium before he published this book just a couple of years ago. And he says, a life based on pleasure, the pleasurable life, a life based on instant gratification. Ultimately, you're going to find that person becomes miserable. Exactly like the Gita says, in the beginning it's like nectar, in the end it's like poison. He says, by contrast, the good life, or the meaningful life, is one which has a spiritual orientation, and he himself is atheist, so he doesn't mean in a strictly religious sense. But you should have a bigger purpose in your life than just hedonism. I want to maximize my happiness on a day-to-day basis. You should have a larger purpose. And then he says, what's the recipe to obtain authentic happiness, true happiness? He says, this is very important. Number one, identify your signature strengths. This is his language. Identify your signature strengths. What are your unique talents? And number two, find a vocation, a calling, a line of work, a way of being that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths. Here again, we find deep parallels with Bhagavad Gita. Because the Gita teaches again and again about this concept of swadharma or swabhava. Swadharma. What is swadharma? Swadharma is based on our gunas and our karma. Guna means our innate qualities. And what are those qualities? Sattva, rajas, tamas. You see, there are different kinds of work, different lines of work, different vocations for different people with different temperaments, different personalities. You see. Swadharma. And Gita tells us, figure out what your swadharma is, and then find a line of work that is in line with your swadharma, your swabhava. Swabhava niyatam karma kurvan napnoti kilvisham, Krishna says. By engaging in work that is in line with your swabhava, and by doing it in a nishkama way, without being attached to the work or to the fruits of the work, if you can do it as karma yoga, that is a royal road to the highest goal of God realization. That's the beauty. And you see how just very recently positive psychologists are coming to the same insights that the Gita reached and these other great scriptures of Hinduism reached many, many, many hundreds of years ago. Okay? So sattvika happiness is more of this authentic happiness that comes from deeper within. When you're not spending all your time trying to gratify the ego, the body, and the mind, trying to gratify the body, gratify the mind, when you try to identify with your deeper spiritual nature, and you try to live your life in such a way that you let that deeper soul within manifest in every moment of your life, you're going to find that you are much happier as a result. And that happiness is much deeper. It's a qualitatively different kind of happiness. Even happiness might not be the right word. Joy, peace, something like that. Contentment. Those might be better words. So, just to kind of sum up, and then I'd love to hear from you. A few practical suggestions. Number one, ask yourself, remember, brutally honest self-assessment. Where do I stand? Right now. Right now. How sattvic am I? And you need to go through, this is a detailed thing. You have to take a detailed inventory and be brutally honest. And sometimes, as I said, it helps to involve your loved ones, to just to bring in a reality check. From the moment you wake up to the moment you sleep, and then also how long you sleep, and then what's the quality of your sleep. Do you need to take 2 shots of whiskey before you sleep? That's something you also have to ask. Many things. That's first. Which guna predominates in you? Number 2. As spiritual aspirants, it's very, very important every day to set aside some time for meditation of some sort. Now, you might ask, what kind of meditation? That's up to you. Vedanta, the beauty of Vedanta and Hinduism in general, it's not a one-size-fits-all religion. That's the beauty of it. Hinduism has this beautiful concept of Ishta Devata. God is one. Ekam Sad Vipra Bahuda Vadanti, says Rig Veda, one of the most ancient scriptures. The truth is one, the reality is one, but sages call it by various names. The beauty of a Hindu household, you'll find, this is very typical, this is true of my own household. Your mother might be worshipping Ganesha, father might be worshipping Kali, the kid might be an Advaita Vedantan, but everybody's a good Hindu, you see. So that's the beauty of Hinduism. So in Hinduism, the first step is, what is my individual temperament? And what spiritual practices should I engage in to make maximal spiritual progress? And there's no one-size-fits-all to that. For one person, it might be bhakti yoga. They're just innately devotional in nature. So that the primary yoga, the primary spiritual practice should be bhakti. A combination of prayer and worship, japa, for instance, mantra japa. For another person, they just don't have that inclination. They're more intellectually inclined. For them, it might be jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge. For another person, they're very active. Karma yoga might be good for them. You see. But knowing your own personality, your own temperament, and which guna predominates in you will help you to decide what your main spiritual practice should be. So, in any case, set aside some time for your main spiritual practice. That's very important. But also important, this is something that we neglect. Some of us as spiritual aspirants think, some of you might actually have received spiritual initiation. We give initiation in our tradition, and there are many other traditions. You're often given a mantra. Your guru will tell you, meditate twice a day, do japa, or something like that. And some people think, well, I do my 5 minutes or 10 minutes of meditation every morning and evening, and that's my spiritual practice. That's not enough. Each of us has to ask ourselves, what do we do outside of the meditation room? After that 5 or 10 minutes, what are we doing for the rest of the day? Alfred North Whitehead is a famous philosopher, Western philosopher. He was a professor at Harvard for many years. He gave a very beautiful definition of religion. He said, religion is what the individual does with his own solitariness. And if you are never solitary, you are never religious. So put this in a simple way. What do you do with your free time? What do you do with your free time? Not when you're at work, when you're busy. When you have a few spare moments, what do? That's the true test of your spiritual level, your spiritual power. So each of us should ask ourselves these questions. That's why things like this, what kind of music do I listen to? What kind of movies do I watch? How do I interact with other people? You see, what do I do with my money? All of these things are relevant. You should try to spiritualize every moment of your life. And so I'll end on that note. Rishi Aurobindo, he said, all life is yoga. All life is yoga. Some of us think yoga means when you're sitting in the shrine and doing prayer, meditation. All life is yoga. Everything in life is either a conscious yoga or an unconscious yoga. That's the interesting thing. Many of us have faced terrible personal tragedies. Maybe you lose a loved one. You're in deep suffering. The last thing on your mind might be engaging in spiritual practice and thinking of God. later you realize it was through that suffering that you grew spiritually. Even that suffering was a kind of yoga. The first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, do you know what the title of the first chapter is? Anyone know? Arjuna Vishada Yoga. The yoga of Arjuna's depression and sorrow. Suffering itself is a kind of yoga. Everything in life can be a yoga if you change the attitude. So Swami Vivekananda, he used to say, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. Try to learn from every single experience in your day-to-day life. Good, bad, ugly, neutral, or otherwise. Then you're a real spiritual master. Thank you. So, questions, right? I think that this is time for questions, I said.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Swamiji, for this wonderful talk, enlightening. And I'm sure a lot of us, as I earlier said, we came in with a lot of opinions and views, and I'm sure we are all, a lot of us are brimming with perspectives. A lot of your questions would have already been answered, during the talk itself, but here is an opportunity. Let's make the most of it. If you have any questions for Swamiji, most welcome to raise it. I'll come to you. Please raise your hands. Okay.
And please tell me your name first.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know most of you.
So I don't want to say it as a question, just I have 2 or 3 points what you mentioned. The first one is, I know Paramahansa Ramakrishna ji was non-vegetarian, Swami Vivekananda also.
Was what, sir?
Paramahansa Ramakrishna was non-vegetarian. He used to.
Oh, non-vegetarian, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as we know that what we eat we become, our thinking become like this. So if we eat non-vegetarian, so is it possible to think sattvic?
Well, yeah, I think they're the
And
shining
the second,
examples.
and the second point is it possible to be only rasic, not all combination, we should have combination of all 3 according to the situation in the current society. So, and how to develop more sattvic quality.
Yeah.
So this is.
Sure, yeah. So the first question, yeah, so I think, look at the lives of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, and then I think that's the answer to your question, is that they're great saints who are non-vegetarian, but who have realized God, who are constantly thinking of God. And so, of course, you don't have to be vegetarian to make spiritual progress. And there, as I said, there are many people who are strictly vegetarian, who are incredibly egoistic about being vegetarian and many other things. And then vegetarianism itself becomes an obstacle in spiritual life. So I'm not saying you should either be vegetarian or not vegetarian. What I'm saying is it's an individual choice. And each person has to decide that for him or herself. And another thing is that spiritual life is a journey of many lifetimes. And I've seen this among some monks also, is that when they join, they might eat fish or something. After 15 or 20 years, they just aren't interested anymore. That's also possible. But it's not the most important thing. And I think too many people make too big of a deal out of food. It's one factor, but notice that in the Gita, there's so many other things that are classified in terms of the 3 gunas. And making food the be-all and end-all is very dangerous in spiritual life. Far more important is renunciation of lust and greed. There's an incident recorded in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna when the future Swami Vivekananda, Naren, comes with his friend Bhavanath. And Naren comes and says to Sri Ramakrishna, Bhavanath, the great Bhavanath, has just renounced pan and fish. Mach pan tag koriche. Sri Ramakrishna scolds him. Doesn't scold him, but he says, why did you renounce those things? True renunciation is renunciation of lust and greed. He's not saying don't renounce pan and fish. That's fine. But there are much harder and more fundamental things to renounce than that. And if you haven't renounced lust and greed and you're just a staunch vegetarian, you're not going to make much spiritual progress. That's the answer to the first question. Second one is, how do we make ourselves more sattvic on a daily basis?
Is it possible to become only sattvic in current society?
I see. Current society, you're saying, is so kind of rajasic in a way that it's very difficult for us to become fully sattvic. That's true, but I always like to see the glass as half full rather than half empty and see things as opportunities. Think of everything as a kind of as a test. So yeah, it's easier than ever to engage in all forms, all the different kinds of instant gratification. Pornography and this, and there are a million things that people are getting sucked into these days. If you can resist, every time you resist the impulse to surrender to those temptations, what happens? You build those spiritual muscles. You see, when you go to the gym and you lift weights, that's called resistance training. In the same way, current society is saturated with different forms of instant gratification. Every time you resist, you strengthen those spiritual muscles. You see. So in that book that I mentioned by Anna Lemke, that Stanford psychologist, Dopamine Nation, she talks about how different ways of dealing with social media addiction. And there are different strategies. And one of them is what she calls self-binding strategies, where you make a certain resolution. One is, for instance, and it could be parents telling their kids to do this. For instance, I will only use social media on my laptop or iPad. You might think, well, how does that help you? Because one of the biggest problems is the smartphone. The way that Anna Lemke puts it is, a smartphone is like a 24/7 hypodermic needle. Because it's always on your person. I think every single one of you has a smartphone on you right now. Literally, you can take the injection, that hit of heroin anytime you want it. So if you restrict your social media use only to iPads and larger devices like iPads and laptops, you almost instantly curtail the just sheer amount of time you spend on social media. This is one very practical strategy. You might also say, I'm only going to use social media at fixed times of day. I won't look at my phone before the last hour before I go to bed. Things like that. So it doesn't mean that you have to go cold turkey, that you have to just give up everything. I think that's unrealistic for most people. But try to regulate your use of social media. And every time you do that, you grow spiritually. You build your spiritual muscles through this spiritual resistance training. And so in a certain sense, this age of instant gratification presents countless opportunities for spiritual growth. If you just look at it the other way around, and you can sort of resist these temptations, you can actually grow spiritually. Thank you. Yeah, next question. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. A lot of us know you already, but for the benefit of
what's your
some,
name?
can we have your name, please?
I'm Sanjeev Chaturvedi.
Sandeep.
Sanjeev.
Sanjeev. Hi, thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeevji. Thank you, Swamiji. Yes, please.
Thank you, Maharaj. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
This is Lalita Bhattacharya, one of the RBAT devotees. Mine is more a comment and a query as well. I think on the point of Rajasic, Tamasic, and Sattvic, that kind of integrates or converges across our lives and our behavior throughout life. In today's competitive world across, and with all so much of globalization happening, would you comment or would you say that being a bit of Rajasic and trying to bring in the Sattvic into our interactions would be more appropriate, because being naive and a bit of naivety in today's world we all know about it with the corporate structures and the world going global. I think we have to have a bit of, some kind of, one would have to think how you would accordingly adapt to the situation. Would you like to throw some light on it? Because this is an area where the Vedanta society and the Vedantic thinking would have large repercussions in the coming world.
Sure.
So maybe you can comment a
Sure,
little on
yeah,
that.
thank you. That's a good question. It reminds me of an incident. I think it was Yoganandaji, one of the future monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna asked him to go out and buy a pan or a pot, something, for cooking. So he gives him money. He goes off to the store, buys a pot, comes back. Sri Ramakrishna says, "Hey, let me see the pot you got." He gets it, looks at it, there's a giant crack. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, "Hey, you got a defective pot. You wasted valuable money on this. That guy, he took it to you. He's taking you for a ride." And Yogananda said, I didn't want to make a fuss about it. He's such a nice person, he's poor. Sri Ramakrishna says, "I told you to be shoro, but not to be foolish, not to be gullible, naive." There's a fine line, but an important distinction between being naive, that's the word you used, or gullible, or kind of little foolish, and being practical and sensible. And see, shorol is a very difficult word to translate in the English. It's a Bangla word, it's a beautiful word, shorol, shorolata. Sanskrit would be saralata. Because it combines different virtues. One of them is guilelessness. Guilelessness, it means that you don't have a cunning mind, you don't have a calculating nature. You're simple in that way. But the word simple in English has a kind of negative connotation. Simpleton, naivete, these kinds of things, which that's not what's encouraged by Sri Ramakrishna. When he says you should try to be shorol, it means you're free from this calculating, cunning nature, but you should not be foolish. You shouldn't let yourself be taken for a ride. So that's important. So what I would say is, in answer to your question, it's important not to be naive, it's important not to be foolish, but that doesn't mean you have to be rajasic. You see? Yeah, be shorol, be guileless, but also be practical and sensible. That's also sattvic, you see? Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else who want to ask a question? Oh, sure.
And your name?
Hello, my name is Sharan, Shubha Shanti Vamsha. I just have a question. What determines the predominant guna we were born in? So that's the first part. Certain people are born with sattvika, rajasika,
Sure.
tamasika, and so on. So what determines it? Karma.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, if you are born as predominantly tamasic in nature,
Yeah.
would you have to become rajasic first because you need that determination to become sattvic?
Very good.
Would it be more difficult
Sure.
for tamasic to become sattvic?
Yeah, wonderful questions. So the first question is, why is it that some people are born very sattvic or very rajasic or very tamasic? And it's true. You might have 3 children and each one is very, very different from the beginning, even though you raise them in the same way. Because of our purva janma samskaras. What did we do in our previous lives? See? So if we, in our previous life, engaged in very sattvic activities, we're going to be born kind of naturally sattvic. If we were highly rajasic in our previous birth, we'll be born with more rajas. And so that's the short answer to your first question. The second, remind me again, sorry.
If you are tamasic, would you
Oh yeah,
be
thank you.
rajasic?
Very good, exactly. So if you're predominantly tamasic, do you first need to pass through rajas in order to get to sattva? Usually the answer is yes. This is why, and this caused quite a bit of controversy a few months ago actually. There's a brouhaha in India. A prominent monk of a different monastic organization criticized Swami Vivekananda for teaching the youth of India the following. He said, what did Swami Vivekananda teach these youth? He said, better for you to play football than to read the Bhagavad Gita. He says, what kind of spiritual teacher is this? This is madness. And we revere this person? Crazy. And it causes huge uproar, and there's a lot of fighting on both sides. And so in a previous lecture I gave a couple months ago, I brought this up without naming names. And I said, this is what happens when you take things out of context. And then I gave the context. Swami Vivekananda made this statement in his lectures from Colombo to Almora. And the context was in the context of these 3 gunas, and what he said and what he saw at the time, late 19th century India, British colonial India. The country was steeped in tamas. Indians had 0 self-confidence. They had no faith in themselves. They could barely get up out of bed. And he said to these youth, he said, the first priority for you is to get out of this tamasic funk. And reading the Gita and pretending that you're very sattvic is not going to get you anywhere. You need to be rajasic first. Do something. Go out and do something and achieve something first. Only then are you qualified to be sattvic. That's why after Swami Vivekananda visited the West and then came back to India, and a lot of people asked him, tell me about the West, and are they really, I hear this all the time, are they really, I mean, you're teaching Vedanta, but are they receptive? He says they're more receptive than many Indians. Why? And he gives the explanation of the 3 gunas again. He says, because most Westerners already are up to their necks in material enjoyments. They know what bhoga is all about. They pass through what Sri Ramakrishna calls bhoganto, the end of enjoyments. So they're ready for renunciation. Because they're a very rajasic culture. I want to do this. They're full of ambitions. They realize they achieved their desires. They're often very high achievers. And then they ask themselves, what next? What's next is becoming sattvic, spiritual life. And in India, he said, a lot of people haven't even achieved anything meaningful. He said, Buddha Dev had something to renounce. He had a kingdom, he had a palace, he had a beautiful wife and children, and that's renunciation. What is it for a homeless person, a beggar, to renounce? What are you renouncing? You don't have anything to renounce. First achieve something in life, so that's rajas. You need some rajas to achieve things in life. The next step is asking yourself, what next? And then spiritual life begins and you try to become more sattvic. Thank you. It's a very good question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Swami. Okay.
Pranam Swamiji. Thank you so much.
What's your name?
My name is Pranab.
Pranav.
Very profound insights into the three gunas. So the first question is, extrapolating on the thing that the gentleman just asked. I think Bhagavad Gita also says this, right? Once you have any of these qualities, sattvic or rajas or whatever, you imbibe that in the next birth,
Yeah.
and you carry it further.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, I think he mentioned that you're writing a book on karma and rebirth and all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So there are many religions which don't believe in rebirth and all this stuff. How do you explain this to them? Because
Yeah.
how do you think that they would believe that once you develop these qualities in this birth, you're
Yeah.
going to carry this forward in the next
Yeah.
birth?
Yeah.
Are they not lost? Because they would think that anyways this is the end, and if I don't achieve moksha, if I don't achieve the sattvic qualities, then I will not gain anything in this birth, right? So for them, then this birth would be the end, and they would not carry it forward. That's
Yeah.
the first question.
Okay.
Second question, I think everyone in life wants to go upwards, like you just mentioned, we need to practice. I think meditation and concentration of mind is one of those main qualities that one needs to imbibe, right? To keep going upwards. What are the typical suggestions or some of the strong recommendations that you give for one who's practicing meditation? What practices can actually help them get
Sure.
deeper concentration?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So, okay. Whenever people ask multiple questions, I forget the first question. Tell me extremely quickly what the first question was.
Further extrapolating on what he just mentioned, when Bhagavad Gita mentions that you take it in the next birth.
Thank you. Oh, yeah. No. I got it. Okay, yeah. I just need that little cue. Okay. So, regarding that question, see, I don't think we need to be evangelizers. And I don't think it's in keeping with the spirit of Vedanta. Often born again people are the most kind of evangelical, and I want to convert everyone to my mindset, and now karma and rebirth are true, so now you have to believe it too, or I'm vegetarian, therefore you have to be vegetarian. And this is all, it stems from spiritual immaturity in my opinion. In the gospel, the author of the gospel, Mohandas Gupta, he was a highly educated, Western educated kind of a person, he was an intellectual. And he once asked Sri Ramakrishna, is it going to harm my spiritual life if I don't believe in rebirth? He just didn't believe it. He was too steeped in kind of Western rationalism to believe this stuff. Sri Ramakrishna says, no, you don't need to. He's speaking as a Hindu. Forget about non-Hindus. A Hindu is asking, I just somehow don't really believe in karma and rebirth. Is that going to harm my spiritual life? Sri Ramakrishna says, no. But never think that my opinion alone is true and that everybody else is false. Don't become a fanatic about your views. That's what he said. And that's really important. So, in the case of people who are, let's say, followers of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Orthodox Abrahamic religions don't accept these doctrines of karma and rebirth. Is that going to harm their spiritual life? No. Do we need to show them the light and make them all believers in karma and rebirth? No. We should not do that. Because these are, Swami Vivekananda used to say, these kinds of doctrines are what he called secondary details. They're very important for us as Hindus, and for Buddhists, and for Jainas, and for Sikhs, all the people who believe in rebirth. But never say that it's essential for all spiritual aspirants across the world to believe in what I believe. That's a form of fanaticism. And it's not true. You don't need to believe in karma and rebirth to attain moksha. You don't need to. That's the first question. Oh, now I forgot the second question. Remind me very quickly.
Sorry, by the way, that's not what I meant.
Oh, that's not what you meant. Okay.
What I was asking for is how do you explain to people,
I see.
Yeah, though
Okay.
they feel that they're lost if they
Yeah.
can't carry it forward to the next birth. Of course,
Are you talking about Hindus or non-Hindus?
both, right? So
Well, that's what I said. I'm saying we can't make generalizations. As I said, in the case of many non-Hindus, we don't need to evangelize. And they may not be receptive, and it's not necessary. If there are people, non-Hindus, who are receptive, or even Hindus, who are sort of skeptical of karma and rebirth, but are kind of on the fence or sort of open-minded, then you can bring in all sorts of arguments, if you want. But I'm very much against proselytizing. I just don't believe that that's in the spirit of Vedanta. But what are some ways? Some of the things you can say are, you can mention some of the new books that are published by Jim Tucker. Has anyone heard of Jim Tucker? He's a researcher at the University of Virginia who has done very, very interesting research into children, and American children who claim to have memories of their past life. Extremely interesting. And he investigates these cases. And he gets phone calls from all over the country, all over the world. And I'll just mention one case, which is very interesting. There's a kid. Now he's a teenager, but at the time he was about 2 years old. James Leininger. And 2 years old, middle of the night, he'd be shouting and screaming, having terrible nightmares. And his parents, in the beginning, they just kind of dismissed them as they were trying to ignore it and just kind of soothe him or whatever. But the nightmares kept recurring. And then he started speaking during his nightmares. Mayday, mayday! The plane's on fire! The plane's on fire! This is weird. And then, after he wakes up, he would sometimes be drawing planes and drawing, really morbid stuff, like planes on fire, crashing into the ocean. And then he starts dropping these little details. Oh, I was a fighter pilot in my previous life. Parents were like, what the heck? I think that one of them was Christian, one was agnostic or something. But they didn't believe in rebirth. And then he said, yeah, the name of my aircraft carrier was USS Natoma Bay. Oh, one of my good friends was named James Larson. And he gives all these details. His father goes online, looks up, finds every detail, matches a World War II fighter pilot with the name that the kid mentioned, fighting in Japan at a particular place on that aircraft carrier USS Natoma Bay. So this is, it seems to me, strong empirical evidence. Cases like this, these cases are mounting, where even people who are very skeptical, who say like, why should I believe in rebirth? Why should I take what these scriptures say on faith? These are things that you can empirically verify and that have been. Now, how much strength to give to these individual cases is, you have to look at the details of all the cases. And as I said, I'm not going to evangelize, but look at the stuff first. Look at the books. There's a book called Before, Children's Memories of Previous Lives. And it's a combination of two of Jim Tucker's books. So that's very interesting. I think that's one way into explaining the doctrines of karma and rebirth especially rebirth, to people who are on the fence, who are skeptical, who want scientific evidence or empirical proof. That's empirical proof. There's a lot more I can say, but it's a good question, but it would take me a long time to answer it fully. Yeah. Oh, and one more part of it. I'll say one more thing about this in answer to that question. People who don't believe in rebirth, spiritual life can be very daunting for those people. Why? Because this life is the be-all, end-all. You either achieve the goal in this life or you're done for it. Often. And so if you believe in rebirth, it takes the edge off a little. It doesn't mean that you should slacken in your spiritual practices, but it means, as Gita says, Aneka janma samsiddhas tato yati parangati, chapter 6. Having achieved perfection in the course of many lifetimes, one finally achieves the spiritual goal. See, it's a very rational, very sober and mature view of spiritual life. Nobody becomes a saint in one lifetime. It's just not realistic. Of course, we see saints. Some people are saintly in this life, but that's because, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, because they've done spiritual practice in so many previous lifetimes. You see? Yeah. I think let's give some other people a chance, and we can circle back to people with more who have already answered.
Okay. Come over.
Namaste Swamiji, my name is Kedar. Isn't moksha and rebirth a complete contradiction? moksha is you want to be free of all your karma and
Yeah,
go.
yeah.
And yet you believe in rebirth so that if I am born again, I am ready for that.
Yeah.
So isn't that a mistake?
Yeah, it's a very good
The
question.
concept
Yeah.
of moksha.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about rebirth in Hinduism is that there are two different standpoints, two different attitudes toward it. One is, think about the situation in the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna's in deep depression, he doesn't want to fight in the war. Why? Because he's going to be forced to kill his own near and dear, his loved ones, his kith and kin, his guru, his family members. What does Krishna say? Don't worry, this is your sacred duty as a Kshatriya, fighting on the side of justice and righteousness. And by the way, the soul can never be killed. The body might perish, but the soul can't be killed, you see. And so for Arjuna in that situation, in the depths of his depression, Krishna telling him, Vasamsi jinnani yatha vihaya navani grinnati naroparani tatha sharirani vihaya jinna nanyani sanyati navani dehi. Just as at the end of a long day, we cast off our worn out clothes, and then we put on a new set of clothes, just so, at the end of a lifetime, the embodied soul casts off one physical body and then takes up another one. What is there to grieve in that? For Arjuna, in that state of mind, rebirth was a tremendous consolation. To be told that your consciousness persists after the death of your body is a tremendous consolation for many people throughout the world. For people who are materialists, for people who are terrified of death, of what will happen after they leave the body. They'll say, no. What? I spent all, I've done my best with spiritual practice, but I haven't reached the goal. What'll happen to me? Don't worry, Krishna says. Neha vikramana shosti pratyavaya vidyate. Swalpamapyasya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. Even if you take one step in the right direction in this life, that'll carry over into your next life. You see how the doctrine of rebirth and karma is a source of tremendous consolation for many spiritual aspects. Now coming to your question. At the same time, rebirth itself is the problem rather than the solution for more spiritually evolved spiritual aspects, you see. Because what is moksha but moksha, liberation from rebirth? The problem is that we have to come back again and again. The solution is to transcend the cycle of rebirth, not to have to be reborn again. To dwell in either an eternal loka, some kind of eternal heaven, if you're a bhakta, or resting in your own eternal swarupa, your own non-dual pure consciousness, nirvana, whatever you want to call it. For those more evolved souls, the goal, you're trying to escape rebirth, you see. You're trying to achieve a spiritual state, an eternal condition in which you don't have to come back again. That doesn't mean that you won't be reborn, but because many of you are probably familiar with the Bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism. What is that ideal? The Bodhisattva is somebody who chooses to be reborn in order to serve others and to help others out of their spiritual ignorance. You see, we have the same concept in our tradition. Sri Ramakrishna talks about Vijnanis. He says ordinary spiritual aspirants, he says, once they achieve liberation, they don't want to come back again. He says Vijnanis are people who, even after attaining liberation, they choose to come back in order to help humanity, to serve humanity. And so in that context, rebirth, you can transcend rebirth, and yet you can choose to be reborn to help others as well. So I hope that's a kind of short answer. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. More
Thank
questions?
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Actually, I'm sure we would have, but we are a little hard pressed. Yes, Aditya, I'll come to you. One quick one last one.
My name is Aditya. At the very outset, I want to thank you and congratulate you for giving such a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I think everyone will walk out of here feeling a little lighter today. So thank you again. I've attended many lectures like this over the course of my life, and I've noticed that questions tend to always come back to the inherent conflict in the capitalist society we live in today, where that seems to pose an obstacle towards realizing Sattva Guna in your daily living. I think after the repetitiveness of this makes me think that people want to be sattvic, they want to do good,
Yeah.
but maybe they're afraid. So could you speak a little bit about this emotion of fear? What is it, and how can we work with it to as a force of achieving our goals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to answer that question well, I'd have to sort of understand the particular fear. You know, there are different fear manifests in different ways. There are different sources of fear. So I can just give like an example. For instance, some people think that if they're very high achievers, the mic is still working. Yeah. If they're very high achievers, for instance, and then suddenly they attend a spiritual discourse where they're told you should engage in karma yoga and you shouldn't be attached to your work and to the fruits of your labor. One of the questions that comes up often, I hear this a lot, is, won't my work suffer? If I don't have that inner motivation to achieve something through my work, won't I do it in a kind of more lackadaisical way? This is one of those worries. And so I'd like to give an example of, just imagine a surgeon. And that person is about to do a life-saving surgery. The patient will either live or die as a result of the surgery. Now, the person who is very rajasic, if that surgeon is very rajasic, that person is obviously going to do the work to the best of his or her ability. At the same time, at the back of that person's mind, there's a tremendous attachment to the work itself. This is my identity. I can't live without doing this surgery, this kind of work. That person will crave this. If he succeeds in the surgery, he'll want his name emblazoned. Let's say it's a famous person, so he wants his name emblazoned in the newspapers. So and so doctor saved this person's life through this, incredibly complex surgery. This is all rajas, you see. That same surgery, if it's done in a sattvika way, chapter 18 of the Gita, Mukta sango nahambadi dhrityutsaha samanditaha siddhi siddhyo nirvikaraha katta sattvimuchyate. The sattvika person will do the same surgery except with these qualities. Mukta sangaha, without attachment to the work itself. So suddenly if you're put on paid leave for 2 weeks, do you freak out? Do you get restless? That means you're attached to the work. Or are you happy with whatever circumstances you're put in? Mukta sango. Anahamvadi, devoid of egoism. There are many people who are very high achievers but extremely egoistic. Try to take the ego out of the work. Taking the ego out of the work doesn't mean that you'll be any less of a high achiever. In fact, you'll be better at doing the work if you do it right, as a true karma yogi. Mukta sango ahamvadi dhriti utsaha samanvitaha. This is extremely important and I think it's often neglected. Dhriti utsaha samanvitaha. The sattvika doer, the person who's very sattvic, will engage in the surgery full of dhriti, perseverance. It's not that he's going to leave the job half done, or get tired, or bored, or do what's called spiritual bypassing, which is say, I'm too spiritual to do this. No. Do it with full enthusiasm too. Dhriti and utsaha. Utsaha means enthusiasm. Not in a kind of bland way, you do the work full of enthusiasm, but without attachment and without egoism. Siddhi siddhyog nirvikaraha. And this is the final attribute of the sattvika doer. The person is equal in siddhi and asiddhi, which means success and failure. So now, the rajasika surgeon, if he fails, will be depressed for weeks or months, be devastated. You could say that's natural because a person has died. But now the sattvika surgeon is the person who says this. Think about the difference in mindset. The sattvika surgeon is somebody who says, I'm going to do the surgery to the best of my ability, but at the end of the day, I know that whether the patient lives or dies is not up to me. Trump used to say, God laughs twice. And one of those occasions when God laughs is when a doctor, full of confidence and arrogance, tells a patient, I will save you. He says, no human being can save another human being. Only God can save. You see? So that's the sattvika surgeon. It's not that he does the surgery in any less of a sincere way, but without attachment to the work. And if the patient dies, obviously he's not going to be happy about it. But it's not going to ruin him. It's not going to devastate him. Because he knows that that's up to God. Success or failure is up to God. Thank you.
Thank you, Swamiji. Thank you, Aditya. That was a wonderful question. Okay, yes.
So, I don't know whether Shankaracharya believed in rebirth because he said that the world is only Maya.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he's asking about Shankara's philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, does Shankara believe in rebirth? It's a good question. When we study Shankara, meaning his commentaries really, he's written commentaries in Sanskrit on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. It's extremely important to keep in mind two different standpoints. Okay? What are these two standpoints? The Sanskrit terms are the Vyavaharika standpoint and the Paramatika standpoint. From the Vyavaharika or empirical standpoint, you're all real, the chairs that you're sitting on are real, the podium is real, I'm actually talking to you. All the names and forms you see are real. There is a personal God who's creating, preserving, and destroying this world, who looks after us, who responds to our prayers. Right? We're spiritual aspirants. All of it's true. From the absolute standpoint, none of it's true. And the only truth is non-dual pure consciousness. It's not even true that you're distinct from me or from him. There's just one non-dual pure consciousness from the ultimate standpoint. And all sorts of confusion stems from mixing up these two standpoints. From the ultimate standpoint, Shankara, forget about rebirth. He doesn't believe in even being Shankara. Because Shankara was a human being who lived in roughly the 8th century, who wrote commentaries. All of it's false. None of it's true. None of that's true either. No God, no universe. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya is the ultimate standpoint. But, so long as we have not realized Brahman, we need to accept the empirical reality of all of this. We cannot skip steps again, so we can't just pole vault ourselves into the ultimate standpoint. No. All spiritual practice is done in the empirical realm, in the Vyavaharika realm. When Shankara says, practice Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. What is Jnana Yoga? Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. You listen to the great Mahavakyas, Tattvamasi, Aham Brahmasmi, from a qualified guru. All of that's Maya. All of it is Maya. Does that mean that you shouldn't do any of that? No, you have to do it. You have to use Maya to transcend Maya. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, if you have a thorn stuck in your foot, you need a second thorn to pull out the first thorn, and then what do you do with both the thorns? Throw them both away. That all spiritual practice, belief in rebirth, belief in your guru, practicing Jnana Yoga, all those things are in the empirical level. You have to do them in order to transcend the empirical level and ultimately realize that you are non-dual pure consciousness. And that all of this was actually a dream. But you don't want to say it's a dream until you actually realize Brahman. That's the important thing. Otherwise, complete confusion results. Thank you, it's a good question.
Thank you, Dr. Chirapat. Thank you, Maharaji. So as we say, our conversation can go on, and with the kind of connect that Maharaj has brought us to, nearer to what we were a couple of hours back, to perspectives, to thoughts, to realism. This discussion can very well go on, but unfortunately we are hard pressed for time for this evening. I'm sure you all can connect with Maharaji virtually on various YouTube videos and excerpts that he puts up. There's a lot of his talks that are there on the web. You're most welcome to reach out to them. I'm sure that will help you out as well. So in the end, may I request Mr. Prabir Mukherjee to come up here and just conclude the proceedings for the evening, while thanking Maharaji for a wonderful talk, very, very pragmatic, very deep, discourse this evening, enlightening us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.